Who in their right mind would want to be a CISO today, especially at a publicly traded company?
Firmly in the regulatory crosshairs with SEC disclosure rules and a growing thicket of privacy and compliance regulations.
Subject to quarterly interrogations by a well-intentioned board that may, or more likely, may not, understand the nature and the nuance of the threat landscape facing the company.
Under constant scrutiny from members of the C-suite, such as the CFO, despite the fact that cyber threats are exponentially increasing, but the budget for security most definitely is not.
Always hearing the sweet, whispering promise of vendors that can make all of this go away. If only you buy the upgraded triple titanium data ingest and support package.
Finding the strength to motivate and manage an underpaid and overworked team to defend against the latest nation-state attacks, while constantly dealing with Dave from accounts clicking on phishing emails from Microsoft.
No wonder the average CISO's employment tenure is measured in months and not years. I'm Chris Pullum, content strategist at CIO.com.
And I'm Robin Das, Executive Director at Strategy at DataB from Comcast Technology Solutions.
And welcome to Free the CISO, where over the course of the last 5 episodes, we've delved into some of the more unique issues faced by CISOs today, shared guidance for alleviating these issues, and hopefully, freed up a little more time for CISOs to take care of themselves and their teams, all while improving security and compliance. We looked at the CISO's regulatory challenges and saw that compliance doesn't equal security, although it certainly helps. We heard how to express risk in a way that the board of directors can understand. We saw the metrics that matter to the C-suite. We discovered that people are the first and best line of defense for the CISO. And we even learned how to live with vendors. So, Robin, what are you still doing here? And more importantly, what am I still doing here?
Well, Chris, you're right. We did cover a lot of what keeps the CISO up at night and provided plenty of tactical ways to free them up. But what should they be doing with all that free time? I mean, for me, it's working on my pickleball backhand and catching up on the Real Housewives of Appalachia. But for someone charged with keeping their organization safe, what else is out there? Like all good season finales, I wanted to try a bit of world building. So I went across the pond to speak to Simon Johnson from Hoop Cyber, a security operations expert and erstwhile colleague, to get some of his perspectives, especially on the European market.
Hi, Simon. Thank you for joining us.
Yeah, hi, Robin. Pleasure to be here.
We've kind of come to the end of our series, and sort of assuming the CISO can do all the basics well, namely good security hygiene, asset management, patches, address the vulnerabilities, zero trust, et cetera, like what else should they be focused on?
From my experience, there's a never-ending list of things to worry about and focus on. So if you picked up some of the, I guess, the most obvious topics, I think being proactive in the way you look at the threat is always going to be super relevant. Actively hunting for threats rather than just reacting to the alerts that are arriving in your inbox. I think then you kind of step into a couple of other main things, right? The primary thing for me would be all around proactive threat hunting, but making sure that you've got the right plan around how do you handle and deal with incidents, making sure that you've got the right plans around the third parties you work with. Because if you start doing some more active threat hunting, you'll have a lot more activity to handle. So if you can bring in a good security automation skill set, and when I say skill set, I don't just mean tools, I mean but people who can properly understand that, I think you significantly help your organization to take a step forward. And then the final thing is, I've talked a lot about technologies and how you work with other companies there, but having a strong security culture, making sure that you foster a culture where everyone feels and shares your responsibility. Those are the kind of things that I would say, you want to focus on beyond the basics.
So how does the CISO stay ahead of that next threat, and how do they get more proactive with their threat response?
Well, if you look at this from a data point of view for a second, right, one of the things that I think we know is an empirical fact is that everyone has more data than they've ever had before. And in the world of the CISO, that typically means log and event data. Typically means we've seen new activities, more things happen, and we need to respond to them. And if you think about that in the context of some of the security tooling, right? The reason why you use advanced tools and you bring new tools in is because they're going to find things you weren't otherwise looking for. That means you've inherently got more and more data. So if you accept the fact that you're going to have more and more data and that you believe that proactive threat hunting is a smart thing to do, for me, this leads you towards, what we might consider to be the nirvana of detection as code, where you look to centralize all of your security events and logs you see, and then you run a whole set of pre-prepared searches and threat hunts that you believe in. You run them through something like a GitHub repository. You trigger some kind of a webhook into an automation tool, and then you trigger actually the response, right? That for me is proactive threat hunting at its proactive threat hunting that I think a lot of people would love to get to.
Explain to me a bit more sort of practically how you kind of go from some of these tools and then sort of detection and code, and how do you create that linkage with the data?
Yeah, sure. I think this is a passion project for me. So I couldn't be more pleased to give you some thoughts on that.
And for our American listeners, this is very passionate for anybody in Britain.
Indeed. So
the level of passion is very, very passionate.
Yeah, it is. So expect lots of enthusiasm in the coming words. So one of the things, if you come back to the technology proliferation we just discussed, and as a CISO, let's say you have 15 vendors, but you have 60 different technology platforms. Historically, the way that you've brought together the insight that you'll have from those disparate platforms is by aggregating it into some kind of SIEM solution, right? And there's a lot of different SIEMs in the market that you may have worked with from a perspective of aggregating all of your events. And within that event management platform, you will do active threat hunting, but you'll also be triggering on use cases that identify particular threats, etc. And that has worked pretty well. The problem is we're now in a situation where we have such vast quantities of data. Like just 5 to 10 years ago, if you had a SIEM that was ingesting 50 to 100 gigabytes a day, you'd have a large investment in a event management platform. But today you could have 5, 10, 15, 20 terabytes of data a day that you're trying to ingest. And that has caused a number of complexities. One, it's created complexity around how do you search and identify threat within those data sets, because there's a vast amount of data there. So you could be trying to identify a particular threat. You try and run a search, and then you may as well go and off and have a coffee and come back in a couple of hours' time. But also the cost and overhead of managing a platform that has such a vast amount of data has caused challenges. So we've been working with customers to deploy security data lakes for some time. And for us, what we love about that is that we're able to aggregate the same log data that you're currently trying to put into your SIEM or maybe into other observability platforms into one centralized place. And then the industry is moving towards a common schema known as OCSF, the Open Cybersecurity Schema Framework. If you don't know about that yet, after this call, please go and take a look at it. Google it. You'll find there's a fantastic Slack community around this space. And what that's doing is creating a common schema for all of your security telemetry that you can then store in a common data store. And then you access that with whichever telemetry or whichever technologies you want to use. But you can also choose to do active threat hunting on that yourselves by building your own use cases, your own threat library that you query against that set. And that, if you can do that directly as a detection as code strategy, like I mentioned earlier, I really think you're heading in the right direction for where I suspect most CISOs will go over the next 12 to 36 months.
And that's interesting, because that raises like two questions for me. I think the first thing is, should we think of this as a SIM replacement or SIM augmentation? And then maybe the second thing might sort of really be interesting is to think about that active, almost like trying to help me understand this active threat hunting, detections as code. Like, does that not already happen in the SIM, or is it challenging?
In terms of the SIM, I think a lot of CISOs set off on this journey with the intent of going seamless, but realize partway along the journey that that's actually going to be very difficult, because a data store is not an analytics platform, right? Just like we can say that a lot of analytics platforms make really poor data stores because they're not doing the normalization and they're not in any way cost effective as a way to store a lot of data. So we think that the reality is that it is a hybrid approach whereby you would put all of your data into a centralized data lake, and it's the all part that helps me answer your next question. So you're putting more data into the data lake than you might otherwise have chosen or practically been able to do with your SIEM. You should still send, and based upon whatever are the right use cases for you, you should still send certain data sets potentially directly into your SIEM, but certainly you should be sending a lot of data still to your SIEM anyway to facilitate the active threat hunting and the active day-to-day detection of threat that your use cases support. What you would use the data lake for is for more scheduled threat hunting of lower value data sets, or potentially for hunting a particular forensic activity that happened 9, 12, 18 months ago. There's a lot of common data sets that people don't tend to store in their SIEM, right? Network data would be a great example. So, Amazon's VPC flow logs, or certain types of CloudTrail data sets. They're quite noisy, those data sets, and they tend to therefore cost a fortune to store within a traditional SIEM environment. Likewise, a lot of endpoint data can be very noisy. So what you'll historically see is that people will put some of that data, maybe they'll sample the data, or they'll just put findings or events that come from that data set. But what we're talking about is a relatively radically different approach, is to put all your data into your data lake. And when we first set this business up and we started looking at these problems, we saw lots of customers that were only able to realistically, from a technical and a budget point of view, put about 10% of their data sets into their SIEM. That meant you've got 90% potentially of security telemetry, which you're paying a lot of money for from all these different vendors you've got, but that you're not actually correlating in terms of how you defend your organization. That to us just felt wrong.
And so then what are the, so if I was being cynical, could I not just say, well, we're sampling enough, it's going into the SIEM today. What are those trade-offs? Like, what do I get for having all the data? Like, do I get 10 times amount of coverage? Are you just being very, very paranoid? Like, what do I get for this additional data coverage?
So that's actually a really pertinent question, and sometimes the answer is you don't actually know until you need to do an investigation that relates to that particular bit of data that you may or may not have put into your data store. But in terms of running regular threat activities, to run that against sample data of particularly of network data, I think it would generally be seen as not good practice. But it has often been a realistic trade-off that customers had to make based upon budget availability and practicality of the data engineering side of things. So it's a difficult one to answer clearly, Robin. But the simple fact is that we're moving to a world where it's much more practical than it's ever been before to store all your data.
So maybe moving more into a better, maybe the perspective is it's better to have all that data and not need it than to just be blindsided or not have that data.
Yeah, agreed.
The other thing that sort of springs to mind is there's something around sort of the retention periods. I know sometimes people have been challenged because if I'm having to make trade-offs, like are there other trade-offs there with like the amount of data I can store from the tools as well as like the duration? Is that something that you've seen?
Yeah, so that's often a common trade-off. So there will be, dependent upon your industry and where you're based, you'll have to retain. You may have compliance reasons to retain data for potentially many years. Um, if you're looking purely at a data retention period for what is right for your business, we would say that most organizations look at 12 months minimum. But there are some data sets that you just simply can't do that. For example, there is a well-known EDR provider who, until recently, was only able to retain data for 7 days for their customers. So if you had a breach on day 8 and you hadn't stored that data, you wouldn't be able to go back and look at what had happened on your endpoints.
We've spent a lot of this series thinking a lot about the US. With EMEA, the similar challenges, different challenges. How would you sort of characterize the slight nuances between CISOs in the UK? CISOs in the US versus CISOs in Europe and EMEA.
Yeah, well, I think we definitely share the same problems and same challenges. One obvious difference is we have different compliance. We share mostly the same threat. There will obviously be geopolitical differences that reflect different threats for in different regions. There will always be slight variances on regulation, whether that's some slightly tighter regulation around usage of cloud in some of the German organizations you might work with, or whether you're looking at slight variances to compliance regulations and how you handle data and those sorts of things. Those things vary. I think we've seen a lot of really good activity come out of the NCSC, and I think for the UK market in particular, that's a thought leadership area that is not just targeting large enterprises, but actually trying to help everybody. Trying to help organizations go through the likes of cyber essentials to make sure you've got, well, your cyber essentials are covered off, and making sure that you're covering some of the main activities. It's great to see, as someone who lives in the UK, built a career here, it's fantastic to see that the NCSC are trying to take some real thought leadership around helping every type of organization become more secure. I think that's a really great step. So I would say lots of the same problems, geopolitical differences, compliance differences.
That's great. Thank you for joining us on the podcast.
Thanks for having me.
Simon reiterated a common theme from throughout the podcast, which was the data will set you free, especially if that data is combined with automation, except in a far better British accent than mine. It was also interesting to hear that EMEA had similar security and compliance problems to the US, only with much better wine. To drive us home, I thought, who better to talk to than someone at Uber? So I sat down with Hardik Mehta, head of cyber risk at Uber, to get his perspectives. Hi Hardik, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Assuming the CISO can do all the basics well, think about good security hygiene, have a handle on their asset management and owners, their patching and addressing their vulnerabilities, they've adopted zero trust and those types of frameworks. Once they've kind of done these basics, like what else should they be focused on?
One of the biggest thing in recent landscape, especially after the pandemic, it has always been about risk management. So the fundamental question is: you'll have the world class technology, you'll have an amazing team, but are you being a ruthless risk manager, literally on a day to day basis? Because risk reduction in our world is a very broad term, and you can never be 100% zero risk. What I mean to say is the focus should always be on do we have a very simple but a direct way to measure our risk appetite? I call it as a risk intelligence layer, which helps business make critical decisions.
But then how do you get to this simple but direct way of measuring risk in your mind? Is it the risk intelligence layer that you mentioned? Like, how does that manifest itself?
So for mature organizations, like the big banks, the big tech players, the top five retail giants, they have a team of 200 people, 300 people doing this on a daily basis. So for them, it is a very different landscape because they are navigating close to anywhere between a $10 million to a $25 million, either a penalty from an external surface or a branding or a reputational loss. So they have these very sophisticated platforms which will go and do all your simulations based on your asset to control mapping, and give you those signals when certain assets, as well as certain people or the users are behaving abnormally and maliciously, and based on that, we take all those signals along with the human identified signals, because in the world of AI, there has to be a human on top of all these signals who will say yay or a nay, and then feed that engine, which is built on, as I said, a lot of Monte Carlo simulations, a lot of sophisticated risk measurement scales like fair cam, and then they spit out a score anywhere from 0 to 10. I've seen organizations do 0 to 100. um, we at Uber, we have a sliding scale of 0 to 10. But on a very simple lens, when I started at Uber 15 months back, one of my biggest remit was to establish the first a simple scale and then mature it. And the simple scale was, do we have a good understanding of where all our controls are? Do we have a good understanding of where all our assets are? Can we then pinpoint all the control, the assets, and the issues or the findings in one single mapping? And based on that, and the historical incidents as well as fines which we have paid, or even the defense mechanisms which we have built, can we come up with a framework which gives us critical, medium and low? Because generally at Uber, we deal with three big aspects. We deal with trust and safety of our consumers. Second, we deal with a reputational loss and damage. And third, we deal with privacy implications in different regimes and landscapes, because we are operating in 100 plus countries. So a long-winded answer, Robin, but very simple. If you don't have fancy bells and whistles, put it on a spreadsheet, come up with certain ranges that a critical risk, my appetite for that risk is anywhere between, say, 0 to 500K, or 0 to 1 million, depending on how much loss, annual loss expectancy you can bear. A medium is anywhere between, say, 0 to 200, and then low, we are like, we'll work on it if we have time and resources and capacity, and we are in the ideal world. So that is how we started, and then we started building on top of it and started integrating a lot of different tooling to become a sophisticated risk engine.
That was really interesting. So I think I hadn't quite bridged the gap from actually assigning this monetary number to critical, medium, and low. And so to repeat back, maybe was it, you start off with like the financial implications of this thing, and that's almost your simple risk appetite, right? Is that the way to think about it? Regardless of the score, the thing that pops out at the end is a number, and it's a dollar value.
Yes, and you bring up a very good point. So the CISOs and especially the risk managers in the organization, like myself, we have a huge responsibility where we go in and we really get deep into the business numbers. Sit with financial risk managers or financial risk office or in old terms, your ITGC controls and the SOX controllers. We also have a huge responsibility to then look at all the 8Ks, the 10Ks, which we have published in last at least 5 years, and see the disclosures on what the risk appetite was and how is it trending. And then the third one, which bridges both the gap, is we have all these regulations, and SEC is doing a decent job right now of giving you these financial, what they call it as ranges for different business sizes, and it ranges from small scale to mid scale to large scale depending on your 10K disclosure, and they have clear guidance that if you have a breach and the breach impacts your production and then you're on cloud and it took down more than 100 systems, the implication becomes X to Y if you are a Microsoft. And the same implication changes if you are an Uber, and then the same implication changes if you are a medium-sized organization, or a Fortune 300 or a 400 organization. So that is like the end goal, where you map the asset directory along with your SOX control structures and what SOX recommends in terms of your financial loss, as well as the disclosure, and then look at the SEC guidance to make sure, both SEC as well as FTC, that we are playing in those ranges. And in fact, what I've seen a lot of CISOs do is work very closely with privacy legal, as well as internal audit, to then veto it out and say, are we thinking it in the right lens, before they take it to their CEO, the CFO, and then the CEO and the CFO will take it to the board of directors.
And that's really interesting, the partnership and part of this, the theme of this series was like how to free the CISO and what should they be doing, once free. And it was almost an idea that the technology was wrapping up the CISO, or the regulations, the compliance was like kind of keeping the CISO's mind occupied. Once they kind of can free themselves from that, it sounds like they actually should be working much more closely with, some of those teams that you mentioned, the legal team, and especially I think the finance team. I think we'd heard from a previous episode that the key metric that mattered was business continuity, but it sounds like you're taking this a step further, and actually, business continuity is sort of a relatively straightforward metric of how much revenue is coming in through the door, and if a bad event happens, what's going to stop that. But it sounds like with where you're going with this risk management profile, you're explicitly working with a dollar figure, and to get that, it means you have to sort of get out of the trenches. The CISO has to really get out of the trenches and actually sort of start working really closely with finance. Is that an accurate way of, yeah?
Very accurate. We in fact have a cyber steering co where we meet once a quarter, and there are like 3 to 4 discussion points. One is, are the financial controls talking to the IT controls and the ITGCs of the house? Are we blindsided by anything, and has internal audit covered it? And how are we looking in terms of the risk reduction landscape? That there is one slide which is always presented in every quarterly meeting to the board of directors and cyber steering co, is how are we continuously looking at the risk paradigm, number one. Number two in that is how much risk we are reducing in terms of our critical assets and crown jewels, and the third is like what is coming ahead. And this is in conjunction with the finance office as well as internal audit office and privacy legal.
And so it begs a question, which is almost like, how did you get there? Or, was it always that way? Like, did you sort of have this fully formed, risk audit committee sort of working? Were you always continuously monitoring, or was it a journey? Help me understand some of that, because I think what you've described does sound kind of like the promised land and sort of a CISO risk nirvana. But, how did you get there?
No, we are continuously fine tuning it and curating it. It has been a journey, especially at Uber. I've been only 15 months here, but I hear stories that from last 3 years we are getting a lot of headwinds on from the market because we are launching new services in new landscapes. Number two, we are continuously acquiring, or we do very big bold partnerships like Waymo, Instacart, where we are going to share a lot of data, both order data from our retailers as well as a lot of our internal algorithms to help each other do better at businesses. And once you are on that continuous improvement landscape from the business paradigm, the second question which comes from both CFO and our CEO to our CISO and to our CTO is, um, how are we going to mitigate the risk, both in terms of, as I said, the trust and safety in the landscapes we launch. And that's where that partnership with privacy engineering, privacy design, and privacy legal becomes imperative. With this whole AI paradigm, we had to quickly establish so many guardrails around consent of data, training models. How do we do the accuracy checks on that we are not using our consumer data to train our models? And at the same time, as I said, to up level the day to day. So the day to day is very, very complex, and to up level that into a very single slide, telling the leadership that this is the journey we are going, this is the risk we are calibrating, and then this is how we are going to use that risk calibration exercise to map to our portfolio, has been a journey. And this is the first time where we did a very unique exercise, which was we got all the leaders in a room. We looked at our risk top to bottom. So we have a huge risk register, but then we have a parent child relationship in that. And then what we did was get all the leaders in the room. The parent child relationship gave the risk criticality, say, on three different scales. Number one was, how are we prioritizing the risk from, say, the critical to the lows based on technology? Second one was, how are we prioritizing the same risk? Can we do a slice and dice on where our investments are, and did the investments return the results which we wanted on those technologies, or the gaps which we are trying to bridge in those technologies? And the third one was, based on the investments and based on the risk reduction, do we think we want to continue that project, the investment in future in 2025? Do we want to fund that, or do you think that there was not enough ROI from that whole exercise, and that goes to the bottom of the table? So that was a complete manual exercise of at least 3 weeks, getting all the leaders in the room after the tool gave us all the answers and the numbers. And we were really, really amazed to see that the tool gave us something which was insanely critical, but when the leaders sat on the table, we figured out that it is medium to a low, compared to where we want to go in terms of how the business wants us to move at a different pace.
And you brought up a really interesting point, because that sort of brought into my mind was, I was almost like, how did you get there? And it sounded like it was a combination of the tooling had the data, but then there's also this manual exercise that kind of happened over the top. Is that the way? Is that correct?
Yes, yes. We used to rely a lot on tooling and then continue just the investments. But then this time we took a risk based approach, that can we take a 500 row spreadsheet of all our big bets and big investments for 2025? And we did this in September, October, because our November, our planning ends for the next year. And we want to go to our CEO and CFO and say, X amount of money was spent here. This was the impact. This was the ROI, and we want more money in these buckets, or we don't want money in these buckets, and why? And generally it was just based on the ROI, the impact, and keep the lights on. But this time we said, let's put a risk framework on top of it and say, did we buy down the risk? And it was always about that concept that if I have 10 items on my docket, what are the top two or three which people want from me, the adversaries, and how do we protect those three? What are the four or five which will keep the lights up and running, make it healthier as we grow? And then what are the three that even if people get it from me, I have so many controls on top of it that I'll not be impacted or I'll be least impacted. So we did that exercise and came up with the top 15. We could not get to top 10, but in 2025, we want to get to either a 5 or a 7, a single digit number, or worst case, top 10.
That's actually amazing to kind of hear about that amount of work that was put in. And when you say leadership, do you actually mean beyond just the security team or beyond the risk team? It included the business leader?
The discussion there, it was, we are okay spending X amount of money, but can we bring some of these projects to an early close and escalate and expedite a lot of the risk reduction? And once we identified which one we want to escalate and expedite, and then we'll need more push from the leadership, then we took that to a steering co, as I said. And then steering co, we have our CEO, we have our CFO, and general counsel. So once that happened, our CEO takes something like this to board of directors on a quarterly basis. So it is continuous visibility, A, and B. It has to get that top down approval and a top down messaging that, hey, the CEO is watching on this. It's a really important um, program for him as well, and we cannot miss or blink an eye on this. So that has been the maturity journey. It is also some historical context where if you don't have the top down, what do you say, messaging, as well as the authority to perform, when you start doing things at that bottom level or the mid manager level, you'll identify that there's a lot of friction. So we wanted to kill the friction right up front, and we wanted to go top down. It has to be done, and then this is what we'll do to buy down that risk.
Really interesting. And then maybe to that continuous and almost like that sprint nature, is it something almost to do with the genesis or the age of the company itself? You know, if it comes from that Silicon Valley background, you know, if I think about continuous sprints and, you know, those 2-week sort of, you know, what have we achieved in the past 2 weeks, that type of thing. Do you think there's like some of that in the culture that has helped?
Oh, it is. It is embedded in the DNA. So when I was at Microsoft, we had, and this was before Microsoft's security regime changed completely, and then they got Charlie Bell, and then they are on a beautiful mission with Satya and Charlie leading the biggest security program in the world, and I'm proud to be part of that team where I did some amazing work. But at Microsoft, which is a very different organization, 70-year-old organization, and the biggest security organization in the world, they have a lot of guardrails. So to change a policy at Microsoft, it will take you 4 weeks, maybe 8 weeks. Here at something like Uber, the DNA is build with heart, and try to break things and learn from those failures, and then reiterate, right again. So some of our sprints are 1 week, some of our sprints are 2 weeks. I've never seen a sprint more than 2 weeks. And it's always that continuous improvement culture, what we call as that growth mindset, to keep on iterating until we reach to a result where we say, oh, this is good.
And then, I mean, any words of advice or best practices for anybody listening that is maybe not in a startup, that's in a more established company, and do sound really like the promised land for where organizations need to take their cyber programs. But, you know, for those of us that maybe less than, you know, companies maybe older than 10 years, like how do you achieve that, or how do you start on that journey?
No, that's a very good question. And I speak to a lot of leaders in a lot of mature organization, because we have a goal to go there. Our Dara came from Expedia, which is a very mature organization, and a lot of my consulting days before Microsoft were with all these Fortune 10, Fortune 20 companies, and um, I would say the advice is twofold. Number one is always have your fundamentals ironed out very carefully. And what do I mean by fundamental is a very robust asset management program, a very robust cloud migration program, a very robust defense program, and a very robust communication program. People do not put a lot of weight behind communication, but communication and security assurance is really one of the much impactful function. It actually serves as a lever of both line one and line three, and one of the big things which I tell a lot of these leaders and friends, and some of them I am a mentee of, is that you have to embrace the red. A lot of leaders are really afraid of embracing those reds, and those reds can be the observations which your internal audit team gave you. Those reds can be some of the privacy fines you got, or those some of those reds can be your significant deficiencies coming out of your SEC, MSJ, DOJ audits, or SOX audit as well. Until and unless you embrace those reds, again look at the fundamentals and see how do you want to improve on those fundamentals. You'll never be able to start showing the progress at the rate you want to show the progress.
And maybe changing gears a little bit. Okay, assuming the CISO has done all these things, reached the promised land, like how do they think about legacy? How does the CISO create a legacy that potentially lives on in a security program after they've moved on, hopefully to a tropical island somewhere?
You bring up a good point and a smile on my face. So last week, I was at New York's Gartner Summit for the CISOs and CROs at Evanta, and I met a lot of my old mentors from my early days. And I'll bring in a couple of those names. One is Roland Cloutier, who was a CISO at EMC, and then he became the CISO at ADP, where he hired me. Stayed in the role for good 10 plus years, changed the entire paradigm of ADP's security program. And then, in a very interesting turn of events, he became the CISO at TikTok. In fact, ByteDance, and a lot of people raised their eyebrows. And then when I met him when he took that role, um, I was not surprised, because he always loved challenges and he always loved doing hard things. So I asked him that where next from here, and he gave me a really good metric. He's like, a CISO's legacy, especially in this day and age, is how many CISOs you make, which I think is a really interesting metric. That if you are bold enough to make those hard decisions in your environment, you make those leaders who actually are willing to bet on your vision and the strategy, and from there you retire, or you do something else. But then when you look back and you say, in 15 years, 10 people who used to work for me are now CISOs at 10 organizations. Speak to Brett Arsenault a lot, who was a CISO at Microsoft for 15 plus years, and been at Microsoft for 31 years. And he says that his legacy is not the attacks which he cannot talk about, or the defense mechanisms which he has built, or the world class SOC portfolio he has built, where there are like thousands of engineers looking at each threat on a live basis, but the time which he has given back to both his peers, the industry, as well as his own learning. And until and unless you keep on learning, and keep on talking to the groups like the FSISAC, the FS Healthcare. Now we're trying to build something in the tech world as well, and the AI world. Um, you cannot be successful in a role like that.
Thank you for joining us on the podcast.
Thanks a lot, Robin.
Hardik left me with an interesting thought. While a good CISO might want to free themselves within the role, a great CISO should free themselves from the role. Cybersecurity should be a team sport, and what better way to play the game than with a team of MVPs, especially if the number of opponents the CISO has to face continues to grow. As we heard in episode 1, regulations provide the rules of the game, but just following the rules doesn't mean you'll win the game. Although statistics like yards per attempt, average yards per carry, tackles for loss are meaningful for players on the team, we learnt in episode 2 and 3 that for the owners of the team, namely the board and C-suite, the most important metrics are simple: win or lose. Like any great coach, episode 4 highlighted the need for the CISO to create the right culture and then have faith in their team and trust the process. And although having the right equipment matters, as we discussed in episode 5, if the players are wearing 3 helmets or have the latest in cleat technology but can't even lace up their boots, it won't help them on the field.
So how do we get out there and win one for the Gipper?
Well, playing on the field is thirsty work and requires plenty of hydration. For security teams, the thing that quenches that thirst is clean, standardized data from a single source of truth. As we heard throughout the series, without this type of data, the team can't function.
Making you the water boy?
Well, at least the second string water boy.
You're selling yourself short there, Robin. You've been the play caller for this podcast at the very least. Whether that makes you the offensive coordinator or the head coach, well, I'll leave that one to you. Now that the final whistle has been blown on the season of Free the CISO, it's time to start tailgating. Thank you for listening, and if you missed any of the previous episodes, they are all available to download from CIO.com, Apple, YouTube, or Spotify.
And as we close out, a huge thank you again to all our guests, our friends at Foundry, and the real MVPs, Cora, Lisa, Jason, and Amy. Until next time. Thanks for listening to Free the CISO, a podcast by DataB from Comcast Technology Solutions. CIO.com provides these important decision makers with the information they need to lead their organizations into the digital-first age. The views and opinions expressed by the participants are their own and do not reflect any official policy or position of Comcast.